It's not in the face! Thank you.
Hello and welcome to Hey, Not the Face with your host, John Nash, and your producer, me, Steffi Haynes. And today we have sort of an urgent broadcast here because John caught wind of a couple of videos that needed addressing. One is from Joe Rogan, and the other is an interview of Dana White by none other than presidential hopeful and cast-off Vivek Ramaswamy. Excuse me. So, John, first, how the hell are you? I know you're currently pinned down by Isla here, your cat, but other than that, how are you?
Well, immobile, but good. Now we say urgent. We urgently need content for the channel, so that's the urgency. But yes, it's a couple of clips.
I want to start with Dana White and Vivek Ramaswamy because it seems to me in that very short 2 minutes and 15 seconds that Vivek wildly misunderstood Dana White as to how pay-per-view tiers work. And Dana White wildly misled everyone by saying that people that have pay-per-view point status become partners. And John, I know that cracked you up. It had to, because it made me laugh like a banshee when I heard him say they become partners. Because they do not become partners, do they?
Well, I mean, it's semantics what he's doing there, because what he means by partners is he's claiming they get a portion of the pay-per-view sales, but they really don't get like a percentage. You know, if you look, we've seen boxing contracts and stuff, and boxing contracts will say something like, you get 40% of all the pay-per-view revenue, right? Some of the contracts will say something like that. In the UFC, the payments are guaranteed, not as a percentage of the amount of money that the revenue that the UFC gets from those pay-per-views. It's just a flat amount per buy above a certain amount. And so, you know, he's using semantics and claiming you're getting a percentage of the buys. You're getting a cut.
All right. So let's talk about how bad Vivek misunderstood literally everything that Dana told him.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of comical because he instantly, first he was not aware of boxing, paying on pay-per-view, doing the same model. He thought that what Dana White was talking about was almost either that they had equity or were getting royalties, a permanent piece. Because he was obsessed with the idea that this would be permanent money coming in. It's like, no, there's a limited span when the pay-per-views sell. It doesn't, 10 years down the road, the pay-per-view doesn't go back up on direct TV and they make more money. So that was another part of it. And the other part too, he talked about how no other sport does this. And we mentioned boxing, but he was talking about the idea of a split between the promoter, the league or whatever, and the players. But every major league actually does it. I mean, NBA, NFL, they have collective bargaining agreements where the players get a percentage of not just, one revenue stream, but basically everything, sponsorship, TV revenue, the ticket sales, all those the players get a cut of. And so I think what it is the guy's just not a big sports fan.
Indeed. So now that we've talked about the Dana White video, let's move to the Joe Rogan clip because that's a little bit more meaty. It's a clip of Joe Rogan and Brendan Schaub, and they are discussing the antitrust case. And I was shocked to see that Brendan is following along pretty closely. Now, he didn't get everything right, but he had a good grasp. I will say that. And again, he's clearly paying attention. Now, John and I spoke before this, obviously. We're good friends and podcast partners here. And I asked John if what he thought of it and everything. And it's just insane that Joe Rogan is spectacularly wrong in a lot of things these days. But this one, he's really far off, right, John?
Well, I mean, yeah, he obviously has at least he puts on the impression that he has no inkling what's going on. That a possibility he doesn't want to know anything about this because his income, his connections to the UFC depend on him not knowing. But we one of the reasons we wanted to talk about this too, though, is because Joe Rogan has a massive reach, right?
Yes.
Not just amongst fans, but fighters. And obviously I don't have the reach. We don't have the reach here with fighters that he does. There's a few fighters. I get contacted by managers and fighters that watch our show, listen to it. So I know some do. And so you don't want Joe Rogan, being the source of information on this and spreading bad information. So the very least, we're going to get a smaller group of people, much more accurate information on it.
Some of the things that Brendan got right were that he got the dollar amount right. I was surprised that he knew what the dollar amount was. He knew who the initial plaintiff was. He knew that it was Kung Lee. I mean, it is clear that he is following along. And he actually, for a brief moment, shot down a Joe Rogan argument, and that it was for a lot of money and that the fighters deserved it. Because Joe Rogan first starts off with this tack that if he ran the business, they'd probably be broke because he would want to pay all the fighters a lot more. And then it was almost like he thought about what he was saying and he walked it back a little. And that's when he said, but I'd be broke because, then the business wouldn't make any money, because you got to make sure that the business makes money. And it almost seemed like he wanted to take back what he'd said. And Brendan said, no, but the fighters deserve that money. And he was absolutely right there. 100,000,000%, because they do.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that Joe misses, one, is we know the UFC makes an ungodly amount of money. Mm-hmm. So the idea that paying more would bankrupt the UFC is wrong. They can pay more. It's just that they're taking the option. They don't see that they need to. They have no pressure to pay more, so they don't pay more. Brendan was also, he pointed out, Joe asked, is it legit? Brendan said it was legit. Mm-hmm. Brendan pointed out that he did make some mistakes. He got wrong the number of plaintiffs. He said there's 60, and I think he was really trying to say about the named plaintiffs, which would probably was thinking 6 and said 60 on accident. There's actually 5 named plaintiffs for the Lee case. There's 1,200 potential class members. So every fighter from 2010. He did get
that part a little wrong, but later he sort of corrected himself and saying like half the roster or almost all the roster, something along those lines.
Yeah, and he's going to get, himself, Brendan, he had 7 fights in that period. So he stands, if they win, to be compensated for those 7 fights, which, we can go in later, the math, what the potential payout for that is. This is key. He might have inside information. Maybe he's talked to some of the fighters that are the named plaintiffs or whatever, because he was saying they had a chance to settle and they didn't. I have no inside information. We're not part of the negotiations, but maybe the UFC did make an offer and they didn't. Because I do know, even though the Lee case, injunctive relief, is not on the table, if you're going to settle, you got to get the fighters to agree. And you'd probably not just settle this case, you'd settle the next one, Johnson, right? I know John Fitch and Nate Quarry, who's no longer a class member, they were very upfront about the idea they want some sort of remedy and change in the system. So it is very possible that the only way there could be a settlement is if there is some sort of change to the UFC contract structure.
And that would be the injunctive relief.
Yes, that'd be that in this case, it wouldn't be ordered by the court. It'd be part of the settlement, the relief package. But basically, it's not it's not on the table with the jury and the judge right now. But if you're going to settle, you might have to include some sort of injunctive relief to get the named plaintiffs to agree.
All right. Now, something else that was a point of contention in this video was Rogan talking about monopolies and citing the NBA and the NFL. And you have some thoughts on that. So let's share those.
Well, it's a common mistake people often will bring up. He goes, if the UFC is a monopoly or has monopoly power, well, don't the other leagues? Why aren't they being sued as monopolies? Doesn't the NBA or NFL aren't they monopolies? And the answer is yes, they are. They have monopoly power. There's a lot of papers and studies done on that. The reason they're not sued is because they have a collective bargaining agreement with the players. When the players are a union, that is considered a monopoly itself. And when you have a collective bargaining agreement with the owners, the courts have determined that grants them an antitrust exemption. That's why whenever there's some sort of labor dispute, instead of going on strike now, what the players do ever since the NFL versus or White v. NFL case back in 90, I think it was, could be off by a year. The players, what they do is decertify the union. And by decertifying the union and becoming an association instead of a union, what that does is it no longer do they have a CBA and have a collective bargaining agreement. So no longer do the owners have an antitrust exemption. The players, though, as an association, can file a masked lawsuit, basically a class action against the owners for antitrust violation. And so the owners, because the only way those leagues can operate is by engaging in antitrust violations, it's against the Sherman Act. The owners can't get together to collude to determine which player gets drafted where, which players can sign where and stuff like that. All that is the stuff that makes a professional league function are antitrust violations. So they need then to negotiate with the players, and then they end up settling. There's no reason it has to be 50-50, but usually, I guess the Nash equilibrium, the other John Nash, the more famous one, a Nash equilibrium says it generally comes out to about a 50-50 split.
What else in this video got your attention?
Well, I mean, what got my attention is what a lot of people will say, and Rogan kind of expressed a common view. Why is the UFC a monopoly? They can't grasp the concept that they have they're a monopoly. And because you can look at there's competitors, there's Bellator, there's PFL, there's Strikeforce in the past. How can we call the UFC a monopoly when there's these other entities out there? And this gets back to the kind of the legal definition and what we use in an economic definition, the more professional use, and the common use. Webster's dictionary, you look it up. A monopoly is you are the only seller of a good, right? And then the reverse monopsony, you're the only buyer of a good. Well, that's the Webster's definition, dictionary definition. But when we're talking about in the law or economically, we're really talking about monopoly power or monopsony power, which means you're not the only one, but you're the one that can kind of control the price because you have such vast power. And the UFC has 90% of the market. So the other entities are very small. And so when people ask, well, why would the UFC be a monopoly or have monopsony? The simple answer is, first, they got all the money, right? Because they have all the revenue. Two is, the way the system works is that all the top fighters, not only do they have 90% of the revenue, all the top fighters are locked into UFC contracts. They went out, got Pride, and with Pride, they went from having like a quarter, 25%, 30% of the top 10 fighters in each weight class to having 60%. Then they went out and acquired Strikeforce, and they're up to like 90% of the top 10. Well, the way the business works, just like in boxing, you move up the ranks, you become more valuable when you get to the top, right? People have interest in the top guys. Even if they don't follow the rankings, they know who the top guys, who are the guys that are fighting for the championship, who are the big guys. And the UFC admits this because in the lawsuit and deposition, Joe Silva and Dana White both say, we want to put the champions and the top guys on the top of cards, on pay-per-views. That's where they go because that gets more attention, interest from fans. And so if all the top guys are in the UFC, how do you become a top guy? You have to sign to the UFC, right? And the UFC, we know from the case, they've said before, if you want to fight for a championship or move up, they'll often make you sign a contract a longer term before they give you that. And so the UFC not only has all the money, but they have all the top guys locked up. And so the only way to become a top guy and the only place that has the money to pay anyone is the UFC. And that's how they attain market power. Now, a simple solution in boxing, they had hearings in Congress. And they pointed out that having a championship is basically having a monopoly over the sport if you own the championship. Well, the UFC owns their own championship, so you can't call that a restraint of trade because it's theirs. But a simple thing is, why do top guys have to be locked into long-term contracts? If John Jones tomorrow could leave the UFC, don't you think he could make a lot of money fighting Ngannou somewhere else?
Oh, yes.
I
he
think
can
so.
He can make a killing in Riyadh.
Exactly. So the difference is John Jones, we go back in the past, the class action lawsuit, we have evidence of what pay-per-view sales were. The bottom pay-per-views in 2015 were about 150,000 buys per show for the bottom 3 or 4 events. The top events were selling about 900,000. I think John Jones versus Cormier did about 850,000. So those two guys added about over $25 million to the UFC, but didn't get close to 25 million of that additional revenue. If they could get that somewhere else, that if there was a bidding contest where the UFC was dependent on having them to get that extra revenue, they could ask for a lot bigger chunk of that revenue. And that's kind of what we're seeing here in boxing, because they're free to sign with other promotions and you can put these fights in other places. They can get a much bigger chunk of the revenue. And so that's why boxing doesn't have we don't call any of the promoters monopolies or monopsonies. But in the UFC, you have no ability to take that big fight, go somewhere else and keep more of the revenue. So the UFC gets to keep the revenue. And I think that's the part he misses, is he's so in love. I'm sure he has fond memories of UFC. He really likes the guys, but he doesn't quite understand how they set up the system where not only are they have the best brand, the best promoters and stuff, but they also make you the fighters have to come there. There's no place else they can go to become a recognized top fighter. And once they become a big fighter, that's an attraction. They're locked into long-term contracts where they don't have the ability to enjoy the rewards of being a top fighter. Yeah, sure, they make more money than other fighters, and a lot of fans are like, "Oh man, I'd love to make $1 million," but they're getting $1 million out of the 10, 20 million they're generating. That doesn't seem like a fair split to me.
At all. Something that caught my eye and ear with Joe Rogan was that he seemed to be kind of on the money about the sponsors, though. He likes the idea of the fighters being able to maintain their own sponsors. And he made the funniest thing. He made a point, and I don't think he realized that he made this point, but he goes, they took away the fighters' sponsors saying that they look like NASCAR, and then they made the cage looked like NASCAR.
Yeah, I think he missed. That was the objective. Right. They took the fighter sponsorship away because the fighters then would get the money from those sponsors. But by taking away the fighter sponsors, now if you want to be sponsored, you want your brand to appear in the UFC, you have to go to them.
Right.
And they can cash in on all these other spots. That's one of those things. Obviously, does he not talk to the executives about that? Because it's clear he thinks it's such a simple solution, but obviously that their game plan was to make sure all the sponsorship revenue went to them, which I give Brendan Schaub credit. He nailed it, that was the intent.
Yeah, for sure. And Brendan did get something else right as well. He made a comment about what the revenue split was, and he clearly reads your stuff because he said somewhere between 14 and 17%. Now, our latest reports clock that between 13 and 16, I think, or 13 and 15, whatever. But he's pretty goddamn close. He's paying attention.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, it doesn't have to be that he got it from, he's reading our stuff. I will say he got it from our stuff.
For sure.
But if you look, there's a lot of websites that take our stuff and repost it endlessly. So
it was sourced here. It was definitely sourced from here. Whatever outlet he got it from, the source was here.
Yeah, it's all based on the calculations I did. But I'll say this, the UFC's pay went up this year based on all the evidence we have from their SEC filings. I don't know if the percentage of how much the percentage pay went up, though. So they went up tens of millions this year from last year. The amount they paid the fighters, at least that's what it should end up being, tens of millions more, maybe 30, 40 million, who knows the final amount. But the UFC, of course, made a lot more money this year than they did last year. So I don't know how much the percentage change will be this year.
And how much of that 30 million went to the top stars, though? How much of it got doled out to the bottom?
Well, I mean, you can probably tell that John Jones got a chunk of it when he appeared. I don't know. You could guess. I think I calculated around 10 million he got for the Gane fight.
See, there's most of it right there. And then you had a bunch of other title fights too. So I would imagine that 30, 40 million or whatever it came out to, or it ends up coming out to, will be more. The pendulum will swing more to the top tier guys getting the bulk of that.
Well, there's another thing too that happened this year. If I remember right, and I'm going to check really quick, the number of events this year, there were 43 events in 2023, right? Uh-huh. Last year there were 42, but there was an extra pay-per-view this year, and so pay-per-views They pay a lot. They pay. I mean, they were calculating. I think that their estimate going forward would be pay-per-views would pay about on average 10, 11 million per pay-per-view compared to 2.5 million per fight night. And so you're talking just the fact that they had one extra pay-per-view probably added 8 to 10 million in fighter pay right there.
For a minute there, my ears perked up and my heart jumped. And then I thought to myself, wait a minute, this is John talking. Let me think for a second. And then I got it. That's why I said, see, aren't you happy that everything you're saying sinks in now?
Yeah, well, yeah, I guess.
All right. So going back to Dana real quick, I got to go back to that video. When they're on a pay-per-view, when a fighter's on a pay-per-view, that they get endless royalties.
Yeah, well, when a fighter's on a pay-per-view, they get their payment. They might get a discretionary bonus. Usually the UFC gives about $3,000, $4,000 to every fighter in a card, unless they get a night of the fight of the night bonus or, performance of the night bonus, in which case they get no extra bonus. That's the typical. You get your pay, you get your win bonus if you win, and you get some sort of discretionary bonus, right? Select fighters on a pay-per-view will get additional money. And that additional money will be a letter of agreement or maybe an extra discretionary bonus. We've seen that. Or pay-per-view points, right? Or a combination. So the top guys, usually the only people that get a pay-per-view bonus is a defending champion. Usually no one else gets the pay-per-view bonus. And again, you got to remember too, pay-per-view sales are not always through the roof. They're often float around 2, 3, you might get nothing from a pay-per-view bonus or 100,000, 200,000. I think fans overestimate a lot how much pay-per-views sell for. They're used to inflated old numbers, and they always look at the big events and assume everything's going to be like those. So, but that's it. There's no other royalty. In fact, there's other stuff the fighters don't get a cut of. They don't get a cut of ticket sales. They don't get a cut of the merchandise either that are sold at the event. Merchandise that includes their image on it that they would normally get as part of the royalties agreement. So they don't get any of that either. Event merchandise is excluded from the merchandise agreement that pays royalties. Also, the fighters are required contractually at the bottom agreement to sign. In fact, people go back and listen to our UFC contract podcast where we go over this. They have to sign numerous merchandise that are auctioned off and sold. They get none of that. So all these other revenue streams they create besides the fight, they get no piece of.
And that includes concessions. I always say concessions because it always stuns me that Floyd Mayweather was way, way ahead of the curve when he started asking for a piece or all of everything.
Oh, yeah. Well, he has. I mean, when you have that kind of power and you bring in that kind of audience, you can ask for a lot. And then the other thing, too, people forget is like Nate Diaz in his recent fight with Jake Paul, where he's kind of a boxing headliner, he had an agreement where he owns the footage. In the future, if they put that fight on YouTube and it gets tons of traffic and makes ad revenue from YouTube, he gets a piece of that. If they sell it in the future to someone else, a part of a library, he gets a piece of that. If they use it he can use it for his own commercials and promotional stuff. You can't do that in the UFC as a UFC fighter. You do not get a piece. Not only do you not get a piece of the sponsorship, you don't get a piece. You get no rights to those video clips except in your contract now, and probably as a result of the antitrust lawsuit, because this was introduced in 2017. Fighters get 3 20-second clips, but it's only for self-promotion. You can't use it for advertising campaigns. So if someone wants to sponsor you and they want to have a commercial and they want some footage of you fighting, they have to go to the UFC and license that from the UFC. You do not have a piece that you can give them showing you in a victory, some sort of win that you can use for ad campaigns.
Incredible. Now, I have one single bonus question for you. I saw that Warner Brothers Discovery, I saw their stock plummet today and that they're really struggling and that Zaslav is running that place into the ground. And I thought to myself, hey, we should discuss that for just the briefest minute, because I want to know, with TKO signing that deal with Netflix, with WWE, and UFC's deal with ESPN being up at the end of this year, so we're in the negotiating period, how realistic would it be to see UFC end up with Netflix?
I think very realistic. I think ESPN, Netflix has made it clear they want to get into live sports, live broadcasting, because that's the future. Apparently, is making streaming services just like regular cable. Advertising, bring commercials back in live sports, live events. So they're interested. They've shown the WWE. They've shown some interest, and Amazon also has expressed interest. They're doing NFL games. Both of them sit on a lot of money now that interest rates are high and there's not a lot of easy money to take out in loans. Funds are dried up for a lot of companies, but these companies generate such revenue they can afford to buy new big properties. Make a license agreement to someone like the UFC. So UFC is going to be in a great position because they have these two suitors. Possibly Apple wants to do the same thing. People with a huge amount of money. And they also have ESPN that might need to keep the UFC. They've said time and time again that it's an important relationship. It's an important brand on their platform. And so UFC can either, leverage that and go, hey, listen, we have these options with Netflix and Amazon. You got to pony it up. And if ESPN, and they can also do the same with Netflix and Amazon. If you want us to leave ESPN, you've got to pony up a lot of money. And so UFC should get, I don't think they'll get as much as they want. They didn't last time. They had when they were doing the ESPN deal internally, they were claiming they were looking for like a $450 million a year deal, I think, for their streaming service deal, TV and streaming together. They ended up getting about $300 million a year, which is still really good, lucrative, but not as much as they were, shooting for. They're probably the same now, where they're shooting for a 200% increase what they're getting now. They won't get that, but they will get an increase and see consistent revenues going forward. I think they'll get something like WWE, but probably even better.
Wow. Okay. And what about Amazon? Because we saw Amazon, they picked up some NFL stuff. They picked up PBC. That's a big deal. So how realistic, like if you were to weigh out the options between, say, Amazon and Netflix, who's got the bigger swing?
Well, I give both of them. I give both a chance of being someone interested in the UFC. I think it's very possible, but either one. But I don't think before I would have said Amazon, because Amazon has made a clear effort in getting into sports, right? Where Netflix in fact has not officially 100% gotten on board with kind of standard sports. Because WWE's, it's partly scripted, but they've opened up the door. So I would say Netflix, it's hard to say. I would still kind of favor Amazon because Amazon has gotten more engaged in boxing, and MMA seems like a natural fit for boxing. I know Amazon has had some discussions with the UFC in the past about coming to Amazon. So I would favor Amazon. But right now it's just the important thing for the UFC is they have multiple potential suitors besides just ESPN. So they can use that when you have multiple bidders. It's amazing how this works. When you have multiple bidders, your price goes up. I know a lot of fans assume that doesn't happen. MMA fans, they think you don't need multiple bidders for your price to go up, but you need multiple bidders. And here they have the UFC, unlike the fighters, have multiple legitimate bidders.
All right. Well, that's going to about wrap us up for this urgent recording episode. John, tell us what you got coming up.
Well, I have a couple articles coming on Bloody Elbow. I think the first one I was told to get out is about Bellator's finances now that they're merging with PFL. I have what happened to Bellator in the last 10 years. It's not a pretty picture, but we have that. And then also probably going to come out maybe early next week. I don't think it's going to make it this week. Is another piece about comparing the expenses of an event for the UFC, like fighter costs, and the revenue they bring in, and the relationship between those.
Oh, that's going to be interesting. I'll be looking for that one. Well, all right, there you have it, folks. Y'all know the drill. Subscribe, because we depend on you. We're independent now, and we live off subscriptions. So please, if you have it in you, please subscribe. And follow this guy on Twitter. He is at Hey Not the Face. You can also hit him in his DMs if you have questions, comments, suggestions. He is also heynottheface@gmail.com. I am Crooklyn949@gmail.com and Crooklyn MMA on Twitter. My direct messages are open as well. Anything you send to me will get to John. And who knows, maybe you get a mention and we feature your topic. So until next time, please stay safe.
Ow! Ow! Not the face! Ooh! Ooh! Okay, the face!